In this video, I'm going to try to alleviate some of the pain of transitioning from Unity to Unreal. So you've just installed Unreal and you're overwhelmed and scared, and all you want to do is go back to Unity where it's nice and safe. Just take a deep breath. And I promise you, you'll fall in love with this engine just like I did. So let's go ahead and start the Epic Games Launcher, which is basically your equivalent to the Unity Hub. Click Unreal Engine and install the engine. And just like Unity Hub, you can install different versions of the engine. You can also open your projects directly from here. The Vault is a bit like packages in Unity, except that items in the Vault can also be art or sounds or basically anything. So let's go ahead and launch the engine. And let's create a new games project. And here I already have to address something that I keep hearing, and that is that if you want to make a shooter, then you pick Unreal, which makes it sound as if Unreal is really good at making shooters, but for everything else not so much, which is not true. It's really good for any type of game, it's just that it's especially good for shooters. You're not forced to start with an FPS framework and then force it to be the game that you want it to be. You can just easily start with a blank project and make your own framework to fit your game specifically. For this tutorial, let's just pick the third-person template. I'm gonna leave it on Blueprint. It doesn't mean that you can't add C++ files later on. And this is probably where you're starting to panic. At first glance, it seems very different from Unity, but it's really not structured that differently. Things are simply called different things and located different places. Now, personally, I have rearranged all of these windows to mimic how I work in Unity. It just makes it easier to switch between the two programs. So the world outliner is like your hierarchy in Unity. And there's a couple of things that are different in world outliner, and that is that you can make folders, first of all, which is awesome. One thing that isn't as awesome is that you can't disable game objects. You can hide them, but that only hides them while you're in the editor. So if you play, you'll see that the objects are no longer hidden. So that's a bit of a bummer, but the folder thing makes up for it, in my opinion. The levels window is a list of all the levels that are in this scene, whereas in Unity, all the sub-scenes are just simply in the hierarchy at the bottom. Place actors is the equivalent to the create context menu in Unity. World settings is unique to Unreal, settings specifically for this scene. Game mode is a way for you to structure your game logic. Let's say your game had deathmatch and capture the flag. Each of those would have its own game mode logic. And if you're thinking, well, my game doesn't have any game modes, it's just a game. Well, you still need a game mode, so you'll just have this one game mode for your entire game. In Unreal, the brain and the body of a character is separated into two classes. The class for the physical aspect of a character is called Pawn. There's also the character class, which is a subclass of Pawn and has some more features. And the brain class is called Controller. So the player controller is controlling the pawn. You put your input logic in the player controller and you put your character movement in the Pawn class. So these are the three most important classes that you need to know about to begin with. The game mode, where you put all your game logic, the pawn or character, where you put the character's movement logic, and the player controller, where you put your input logic. Now, there's a lot more that you're gonna put into those scripts. This is just a quick explanation of those three very important classes in Unreal. You have your message log, which is your console in Unity. You have your content browser, which is your project view in Unity. If you press this button, it will start to resemble Unity's project view just a little bit more. The detail window is Unreal's inspector. You can only see details of objects selected in the world outliner. So if you select something in the content browser, it won't update your details panel. So unlike Unity, where you have all your components and variables in a long list, in the details panel, you can select your components, and below you'll see all the variables related to this component. One feature that I love in Unreal is the search bar right here, because when you have a lot of variables, it can be kind of a struggle to find the correct one. And so if I'm looking for a variable called visible, for example, and I don't remember exactly where it's located, I can just search here and find it like this. And the neat thing is that this search bar is available a lot of different places. You can search for a specific component. It's also here in the world settings, or even in your project settings and your preferences. If you press the yellow arrow next to a variable, it will reset that variable to the default value. Game objects in Unreal are called actors. To define your input, you go to your project settings, and scroll down to input. And here you have your action mapping and your axis mapping, which is pretty similar to Unity's new input system. In play mode, hit Shift F1 to get your mouse back, and then you can press eject to gain scene view controls. If you want to take control of your character again, you can simply press possess. Unreal has this thing called BSB. It's mainly used to block out levels. They're not really static meshes, but you can convert them to static meshes if you want to. As you'll quickly notice, snapping is on by default in Unreal. You can simply disable it here. In Unreal, you cannot have the same name twice in the same folder, and the full path of an asset must never exceed the limit of 260 characters. The joints in a skeletal mesh in Unreal are not simply game objects just like in Unity. Instead, you have this skeletal asset. And now we've come to the best thing about Unreal, and that is blueprints. And programmers, don't be afraid to use blueprints. Don't be like me. When I started using Unreal, I was forcing myself to use C++ for everything, and I just didn't want to touch blueprints because yuck. I wanted to be in control and feel like I was doing things properly, instead of some hacky visual scripting thing. But then I gave blueprints a try, and oh my god, it's amazing. I recommend using blueprints for everything gameplay related. For anything that's computationally intensive, I would recommend C++. Now, if you're using blueprints, there's excellent documentation online covering just about anything. If you're using C++, on the other hand, that's a different story. Compared to Unity, the documentation for C++ is pretty bad. Oh, one thing to note about blueprints, something that seems to confuse Unity users a lot, is that blueprints are prefabs, but with code attached. Or actually, they don't have to have code attached, but you can have code attached to it as well. This is not a blueprint tutorial, so I'm not going to start covering what all the nodes do, but one thing I will say is that if you want to expose a variable in the details panel, all you need to do is click the eyeball here. Another thing that's unique to Unreal is that even the scene has its own blueprint. If you're making a build and you don't want all your maps to be in the build, you can go to File, Package Project, Packaging Settings, and if you scroll down, List of maps to include in a package build, and simply add the maps that you want to include in the build. If you're creating a slightly ambitious game in Unity, you're kind of forced to rely on plugins from the asset store, and in Unreal, that's not the case. There is a sea of editors. It's very feature complete in my opinion, and chances are you'll probably never feel like you're forced to go on the marketplace to continue developing your game. Oh yeah, the marketplace is Unreal's asset store. If you want to quickly align an object to the ground, you can simply press End on your keyboard and it will snap to the ground below. Duplicating in Unreal is not Ctrl-D, it's Ctrl-W. W for duplicate. Something I wish someone told me when I switched to Unreal: every time you change, delete or add anything in your project, you might assume that these changes are saved like in Unity, but you have to press Ctrl-Shift-S. Or else you might get a nasty surprise if the editor crashes and you reload your project and all the stuff that you added and deleted and changed is gone. Unlike Unity, where I feel like all of the editors seem very different in how they're built, the interfaces look a bit different. In Unreal, it feels like when you've learned one of the editors, the next editor already feels familiar, and it gets easier and easier to learn a new editor in Unreal. Here's another neat little trick: you can copy any variable in your details panel and copy paste your values instead of having to go back and forth. If you press tilde on your keyboard, you get access to the console where you can change a whole bunch of editor settings. Here's how you make a blueprint. Right click in your content browser, press blueprint class, choose actor. Since we're just making something very simple, I'm just gonna call it blueprint test. Your blueprint has a viewport where you can see all the visual aspect of your blueprint. If you press event graph, that's where all your code is. Begin play is just like awake in Unity, and the tick event is like update in Unity. So if we drag from this arrow and write print, compile and save, and let's see what happens. Hello. When you see these white arrows, it's kind of the equivalent of a new line in a script, whereas the circles, they represent variables. So let's make a new variable and call it text and change the type to string. And we're gonna expose it to our details panel. And then we're gonna drag this text variable and directly plug it into this inString attribute. So now let's compile and save again. And you'll see that when I select my blueprint test in my world outliner, now I have this new variable called text, and we can change this text and awesome text. There we go. You can add breakpoints on any node by selecting a node and pressing F9. And when we press play, it'll pause the game and show you where the blueprint stopped. That's it for this video. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. Leave a like and subscribe if you like this tutorial. I will be eternally grateful.